Hey guys, so welcome back to The Oldest Magic. So last time, in my last video, I spoke about the movie The Aeronauts and its connection to the concept of flight and friendship. So in this video, I want to discuss another movie that's also based on a favorite book of mine. So in this video, I want to discuss the novel A Little Princess. I discussed The Secret Garden before, but more specifically, I want to discuss the 1995 film version of A Little Princess. It's a movie that is incredibly dear to my heart. It's one that occupies a prominent place, I guess, in my inner world or psychic landscape, you could say. And I find the storytelling, the art direction, the script writing to be really rather beautiful. And I think it's a great example of a adult fairy tale, or you could say a movie that could be equally enjoyed by children and by adults. So the original novel, A Little Princess, was written in 1905 by Frances Hodgson Burnett, and it's basically an expanded version of a short story that she wrote, which is A Little Princess being the whole story of Sarah Crewe now being told for the first time, which is kind of a mouthful as a title. But the 1995 film version of A Little Princess that I want to discuss is based on the 1939 cinema version starring Shirley Temple. The movie that we're going to discuss in this video owes a lot to that previous movie, as well as the original novel itself. So the 1995 version of the movie brings the story forward from the Victorian period into the kind of late Edwardian period, sort of right on the cusp of the beginning of the Great War, World War I. So the movie stars Lyselle Matthews as Sarah Crewe, and she's a great actress in that movie, and she's amazingly cast as Sarah, and she captures a real sense of sweetness and kindness, intelligence, honorability, and still a kind of childlike wonder. And then you have Eleanor Bron, the actress and writer who plays Miss Minchin, Maria Minchin, in the 1995 film version, and she plays Miss Minchin magnificently. We also have Liam Cunningham as Sarah's father, called Richard Crewe in the 1995 version. Liam Cunningham also plays Rama, Lord Rama, in the kind of flashbacks and sort of fairy tales within the movie that Sarah recounts to her friends, which is an interesting kind of dual role that this legend that Sarah enjoys so much, you know, the actor who plays her father would also play Rama. Kind of like how in stage and film adaptations of Peter and Wendy, the actor who plays George Darling, you know, the father of Wendy, would also play the villain, Captain Hook. That was often how those stories were handled. And I think there's a kind of echo here with that kind of idea, except benevolently, not malevolently. You know, yeah, he's playing a hero, not a villain. So yeah, I love this movie. And when I was a kid, I guess I was around 16 or 17 when I first saw this movie. I can't remember where exactly, but I know that it had a big impact on me. I've always been a fan of myths, legends, fairy tales, and movies that sort of knowingly employ those tropes and themes and structures, you know, the themes and structures and tropes of fairy tales as kind of moral guidance or moral lessons for both young and old. And I think the 1995 film adaptation of A Little Princess is a perfect example of that kind of very elegant fairy tale and a kind of moral lesson that can be enjoyed by the young and old alike. So in the movie, there are many significant changes, but one of the main ones is the fact that this story is transposed to New York City. In the novel, everything takes place in London, but Miss Minchin's school in the movie version is in New York City. And Sarah's father is a wealthy captain in the British Army, kind of stationed in India, but he gets called out to be a soldier in the war. So I think a theme that I want to discuss in connection with A Little Princess is this idea of symbolic royalty. Perhaps I should have said that at the beginning of the video, but whereas with the past video, I wanted to discuss the concept of flight in connection to the Aeronauts and tangentially kind of Peter Pan. In this video, I want to discuss the symbolic concept of royalty, specifically within this movie, but also within kind of fairy tales and stories in general. And it's always been my understanding that symbolically, the notion of royalty, more often than not, in children's stories, especially fairy tales, they're not really about bloodlines and genealogies and, the divine right of kings based on which family you're from. They have more to do with inward characteristics, nobility of character, fairness, kindness, and a sense of honor. These things are kind of symbolic of royalty in children's stories because they're symbolic of a kind of moral code that I would assume, the authors want young children to kind of internalize and live by. But greater than that, I think that these are just aspects that we should all aspire to. And so I think of these ideas as a kind of spiritual map, a spiritual blueprint that we could all gain some understanding from following. So, for example, to be a true princess or a true king or a true queen or a true prince in these stories often has to do with a person who is kind of overlooked. Their worth isn't seen, their specialness isn't seen, but throughout the actions of the story, they're able to display their sense of fairness, their sense of integrity, their sense of honor, which gives them a kind of quality that elevates them beyond the everyday and kind of imbues them with a kind of mythic aspect. And I think that's essential to understanding A Little Princess and these stories in general. A movie that I often compare to A Little Princess is the 2010 Disney movie Tangled. And it's a movie that I love for many reasons. I think that the script is amazing and I think the story is beautifully rendered. But in Tangled, the character of Rapunzel is locked in a tower. And it's a very famous kind of fairy tale motif, the young girl or the young woman, the princess locked in the tower waiting to be rescued by a brave knight or a traveler who often falls for the princess and has to prove his worth. I find that idea interesting in relation to the idea of royalty and symbolic character, because in Tangled, Rapunzel is essentially an abducted child. She's a princess, but she's been abducted when she was very young and she's been forced to live in poverty. She knows she's special. She has a sense that she's special. She knows her hair is magical, for example, and it glows, right? But that is really just a metaphor, I think, to describe the fact that she knows she has some innate Rapunzelness, for lack of a better term, that other people can't see, especially her mother or her fake mother, Mother Gothel. So I often think that in these stories, that specialness is something that children often feel within themselves. They're like, I'm not like everybody else. I'm special. Perhaps not better, but in a child's mind, I think the idea of special means different and somehow set apart from the others. And I think that's a beautiful thing for a child to sort of understand on a higher level. And I think that's what these ideas of symbolic royalty are attempting to convey, or at least that's what they can convey when those stories are done to their best. And so I think Rapunzel's kind of royalty, the fact that she's a royal child abducted from her home by a villain, is kind of symbolic of the idea of all children, all girls being princesses, all boys being princes. They have an innate uniqueness that is specific to them, that often isn't seen by others around them, but should be seen. And through the framing of the story, it's kind of implied that the creator, God, the divine intelligence, or characters gifted with sight are able to see that child's uniqueness or that young person's uniqueness, their specialness, their symbolic royalty, if you like. And so I think the same thing is happening to Sarah Crew's character in A Little Princess. So throughout the story, her father is declared killed in action in the war, and all of her wealth is taken away from her. And the character of Miss Minchin, this kind of tyrant, this haughty school mom, basically robs Sarah of all her wealth and reduces her to the level of slave, essentially, and locks her in a tower, in an attic tower, much like Rapunzel in Disney's Tangled. Rapunzel's hair is kind of symbolic of, her specialness that she doesn't really forget. With Sarah, it's more her ability to tell stories. It's her ability to live in a fantasy and try and embody those fantasies as best as she can. So throughout the story, Miss Minchin is constantly like tormenting her and saying, oh, you still believe in fairy tales? You still believe in fantasies? I'm going to make your life harder. Now, do you still believe? Now, are you still a storyteller? Are you still a princess? And each time Sarah's like, yes, 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 even though she's tested and tested and tested. And I think that's a good metaphor for children not losing touch with their inner kind of sense of spirit, you know? And that's essentially what Sarah in A Little Princess is trying to hold on to, is she's trying to stay connected to her sense of spirit, her sense of a wider reality in which the mysteries of God are kind of moving. Even though other people can't see it, she wants to believe that those mysteries are kind of moving beneath the surface. She's very enamored with the story of Rama and Sita, you know, being, you know, the child of a British soldier stationed in India. And it's very well handled how the filmmakers depict her love of those stories and how they're kind of reflected by the actors who play Sarah's parents, also play Rama and Sita. And it's kind of reflected, you know, the journey of Rama sort of dying and coming back to life, being resurrected, and trying to rescue Sita, his bride, you know, his beloved, from the clutches of the demon king Ravana. It's kind of reflected in Sarah's father trying to, you know, resurrect himself from the horrors of war and return to his daughter. So there's a obvious echo and parallel there that the filmmakers play around with quite elegantly, I say. So you also have in A Little Princess, you have the character of Ramdas, who is a Laskar, right? An Indian soldier or sailor, and he is working as the manservant of Mr. Randolph, who lives next door to Miss Minchin's orphanage. And obviously in the book, he's portrayed as a spiritual man, but in the movie, he's something more. In the movie, it's implied that Ramdas is a very powerful mystic, and with the ability to alter reality in subtle ways. And I find that fascinating because Ramdas in Hindi and Sanskrit means, you know, servant of Rama or servant of God, because Rama, Lord Rama, is often used as interchangeable with the notion of the creator, you know, divinity. So Ram is often used as a kind of epithet to mean creator. So servant of Ram is servant of God, essentially to Western understanding. And so this servant of God, who is also a servant of this rich old man who lives next door to the orphanage, he pays close attention to Sarah throughout the story and helps her because he is kind of moved by her specialness, by her innate royalty, if you like, her inability to let go of her love of stories and her belief in the mysteries of God moving beneath the surface. And as someone who has first-hand experience and first-hand knowledge of those mysteries, Ramdas kind of helps Sarah to reconnect with her father and to overcome the struggles and the torments that Miss Minchin places on her in the orphanage when she's locked in this tower. Much like Tangled's Rapunzel has to undergo as well. So in A Little Princess, one of my favorite scenes is the scene where Sarah's been stripped of her wealth and she's been stripped of all creature comforts for a while, and she's living in this tower. And she's sent out on errands, and she's wearing rags, and she's dirty, and she hasn't, you know, they won't let her bathe properly. And so she's really suffering. She's sent out into the streets of New York to do errands and to fetch things. And the child of a wealthy woman gives Sarah some coins in one scene in an act of pity or empathy. And so the first thing Sarah does is she runs into a bakery to buy a pastry, like a bun, because she's very, very hungry. And so then she goes outside and she's going to eat this bun, but then she sees an extremely poor family kind of in the streets trying to sell flowers. And it's implied that this family may be homeless because they seem extremely poor. And so Sarah, being the little princess that she is and not having lost touch with her empathy, you know, and her sense of care, she gives the bun to one of the daughters of this very, very poor family who are selling these flowers. And she leaves, and the mum tells one of the daughters, give her a flower, you know, give her a flower as a thank you. So the little girl runs over and gives Sarah this long stem yellow rose and does a little cute bow. And the mum says, "For the princess." And I remember watching that when I was a kid, and, your mileage may vary again, but I found that scene incredibly touching and very well handled. And the soundtrack is just beautiful in that scene. And what interests me, I think it's the composer is a man named Patrick Doyle, I believe. But regardless, in the soundtrack, there's a kind of choir singing over that scene, and they're saying the word namaste, which means "I bow before you," or "I bow before the goodness in you," in Hindi and in Sanskrit. So it's kind of a greeting, and it's an acknowledgement of someone's innate goodness and sweetness and kindness, and it's kind of an acknowledgement and a recognition of peace between you and another human being. And it's interesting that that's kind of put into the soundtrack, is that the idea that the legends of Rama and Sita and the benevolent watchful eye of Ram Dass have kind of inspired the angels watching over Sarah to speak, in the Hindi tongue, and to wish Sarah blessings, as Sarah has wished blessings, on this very, very poor family, and giving up her pastry, her bread, her luxury to feed someone else. So it's this kind of beautiful blending of Christianity and Hinduism, or at least that's what I choose to see as someone who is of mixed race parentage and kind of grew up in a mixed religious household, a Christian and Hindu household. I choose to see that scene as those two cultures coming together and sharing something kind of beautiful and something that unites all people, is the desire to help, the desire to serve, the desire to make someone who's suffering, make their suffering a little easier. And that's what Sarah does. And she's rewarded with this long stem yellow rose, this beautiful flower. And I think this flower is also echoed in the movie Tangled with Rapunzel. So Rapunzel's magic in Tangled comes essentially from this magical flower that contains a drop of sunlight that Mother Gothel was using to kind of extend her youth. And hence the reason why when she loses control over that flower, she steals Rapunzel herself to try and siphon that magic back into her. But what's interesting is that yellow flower, that drop of sunlight flower, is kind of a symbol, really. And it's a symbol of Rapunzel's innate uniqueness, her royalty, her divinity, even her personhood, the fact that she's a person with unique hopes and dreams, and that's sort of reflected, as within, as without. She has light within her, but she's also looking for lights in the sky, Every day on her birthday, she sees these beautiful lanterns drifting in the night, and it's kind of reflective of the light, the power of God, the kiss of something beautiful, grace, essentially, moving through her blood. And I think that's reflective of all children who sense that they're special and unique, and they don't have the language to give those insights any kind of real form that adults would understand. So stories like this help kids to be seen. And I think that the yellow rose does much the same thing symbolically in A Little Princess. It's like the mother gives the rose to Sarah, and obviously Sarah, the name means princess, and Sarai. What's interesting is that instead of keeping that symbol of grace, Sarah then passes it on. She passes on that beauty to someone else. And Mr. Randolph, who lives next door to the orphanage, has a son missing in action, a son called John, and he is grieving that missing son because he doesn't know if he's ever going to get to see him again. And Sarah, also feeling like her father has been killed in action, feels Mr. Randolph's pain. And as she's walking home at night, she takes that yellow rose and she slips it through the door handles of Mr. Randolph's front door, in essence to kind of bless him and wish him well. So she doesn't keep that beauty for herself, she gives it to someone else. And Ram Dass sees that act of charity and like genuine kindness and is moved by it. And what's interesting is that that yellow rose obviously is symbolic of light, right? It's obviously rose is love, but yellow is the sun, and yellow is life, and yellow is light. And so it's a symbol of purity and beauty and hope. And she wants someone else to feel that hope. And that's what makes her special, and that's what makes her a princess. And what's also interesting is that, again, to reflect and sort of contrast it with the movie Tangled, another princess locked in a tower story, after Flynn Rider, or Eugene to his friends and loved ones, cuts Rapunzel's hair in an act of love and self-sacrifice, Rapunzel still retains her magic in her tears. So this is kind of symbolic of suggesting that, you know, the magic didn't really come from the flower. The flower is just a storytelling conceit. The flower is just a rhetorical device. Really, the sunlight is in Rapunzel's soul. It's in her heart. And when she expresses genuine grief over Flynn's death, her tears bring back the man that she's fallen in love with from the brink of death. Resurrection, in essence. And I think that's important because, obviously, as Westerners, our greatest story of resurrection is the story of Christ, right? A being who, to many, is considered to be the physical embodiment of love. And I think, in reality, it's kind of how we see things, is that love can take the form of embodiment or expression, you know, and in Rapunzel's case, she is expressing how deeply she loves Eugene, how deeply she loves Flynn, and expressing that through her tears. And it's because of that, because of the sweetness of her soul, because of the fact that really the lights in the sky, the lanterns in the sky are within her. You know, that's God's grace that she hasn't fully let go of. And because of that, that's the power that is able to resurrect her beloved. And the same thing, or a similar thing, happens in A Little Princess, in the fact that after she does that act of blessing with the yellow long stem rose, and Ramdas sees Sarah's act of charity and kindness, he encourages Randolph to take care of an unknown soldier who is misidentified as his son John, who, of course, this unknown soldier turns out to be Sarah's father, who wasn't killed at all, but almost died trying to save John, Randolph's son. So it's kind of like a chain of sunlight, you know, it's a chain of grace and care that kind of ripples across time and space. Because one person cares about someone, and another person cares about that person, and another person cares about that person, the, you know, losses are still felt, you know, there are still wars and death, but there's also beauty, should you choose to look for it. And so I think that's what that yellow rose symbolizes, is the fact that Sarah wasn't thinking about her father, and she missed her father, but she was hoping that Randolph would get to see his boy again. And she was thinking that selflessly and kindly, but that was not to be fate, you know. Obviously, this is a fairy tale. Sarah is the main character. You know, this is a moral lesson that we're watching. This is a kind of modern myth that we're seeing that is intended to leave us feeling hopeful, full of insight and recognition for some of the ways, aspects of those mysteries of God might work when conditions are favorable. You know, it's kind of saying, I know, this will not always be granted to everyone, but sometimes these graces are granted to some. And graces are granted to all, should you have eyes enough to see them. And I think that's important. And that's the kind of lesson that Sarah Crew tries her hardest not to forget, even when she's in the depths of suffering, is that no, stories are beautiful. You know, God is great. The world is incredible and amazing and filled with wonders and adventures, even if other people are trying to control me, trying to, you know, trash me, break my spirit, etc. I am not going to do to others what those bullies are doing to me. And I think that's a key point to grasp. Because in real life, love does resurrect us, right? I mean, I can speak for myself, is that, you know, the people that I love and the stories that I tell for the people that I love, and the warmth that I have for the people that I love, you know, whether that's romantic partners, friends, distant strangers, people who have ever been gracious to me, and I'm so thankful for their grace towards me, and I send them love with my mind, you know, that love, that act of loving and being loved is invigorating. We do come alive. We do kind of reawaken in some way. And so the idea of love being capable of resurrection, I think, is a very real thing. And so I find it interesting that as the movie progresses, this unidentified soldier who is actually Sarah's father, suffering from, you know, memory loss, amnesia, is trying to work his way back to his daughter. And through the grace of God, as kind of figured through the character of Ram Dass, who is acting as Sarah's like personal guardian angel, Sarah is able to essentially reconnect with her father by the end of the movie. And it's different from the novel, because in the novel, Sarah's father does die. He doesn't come back at the end. He isn't resurrected by the power of love. But in this 1995 version, obviously, it's a full-on, full-blown romantic fairy tale. Sarah's faith and her kindness and her warmth, her care for other people, essentially restores her father to life and returns him to her. Her father, as figured as Lord Rama, Prince Rama, reawakens from the dead, slays the demon king Ravana, you know, all the evils of war, and rescues his loved one. I think that's a beautiful thing. And I love the subtleties in the story. There are many, many more subtleties and nuances beyond what I've discussed here. These are just a few. It occupies a very important place in my heart. And as a young person, it kind of reminded me to just be a little bit more gentle than I would otherwise be. You know, when you're growing up as a young man, especially in a big modern city, everything is so loud and crazy and intense. And sometimes you feel like you are encouraged to be just as loud and crazy and intense as the city around you. But then you watch a movie that is such a beautiful fairy tale and is so elegantly handled, you know, that kind of reminds you to embrace that kind of more gentler aspect of your spirit a little bit, to be a little bit more thoughtful, to be a little bit more reflective, and to always be kind as you can be to the people around you. So yeah, so in conclusion, I just want to say that, you know, you might not have the interest in kind of fairy tales and mythology and, you know, Victorian and Edwardian literature that I have, but I would hope that we can all grasp and sort of appreciate the fact that stories are very instructive and beautiful things. You know, they relieve psychological pressure. You know, it's like in real life, happy endings do happen, but they're often hard to come by. And the happy endings and the miracles that do happen, and they happen more frequently than we think, but they're not often talked about in the media. They're not often portrayed, you know, and the world can be a dark place and it can be a world full of suffering. But these types of stories, they are instructive, you know, they relieve pressure, they comfort us. You know, the cynical take could be that they're confections, you know, they're just sweets, they're intended to make you feel good in the moment, but they have no other depth beyond that because everything is tied up nicely in a bow. And, you know, the faithful are always honored and the kind are always respected and, you know, the villains are always punished, etc. And we know that real life is not like that, etc. But I think that's not the point. The point is about stories being a vehicle in which we can discuss the inner world. And the inner world is a world of emotion. It is a world of feeling. It is a world of spirit. It is a world of grace and joy and hope and dreams and a world of darkness and pain. And so that's why these stories are kind of constellated and organized in the way that they are, because we're telling hopeful dreams to ourselves. And that's what I think Tangled is. That's what I think A Little Princess is. I think that's what the stories of Peter and Wendy are. They are kind of hopeful dreams that we tell to ourselves so that we are reminded of the veracity and the power of our inner realms, our inner landscapes, the things that move us on the inside, the poetry, the dance, the wonder, the feeling of falling in love, the feeling of taking care of a friend, the feeling of brotherhood, sisterhood, solidarity. Sometimes stories and fairy tales are the only real places where we can intelligently discuss those themes. It's the only canvas big enough and dexterous enough, malleable enough, I guess you could say, that we can discuss those things with any kind of real depth. And so I think that's why Disney movies are so popular. I think that's why movies like A Little Princess and The Secret Garden and, the story of Peter Pan will continuously be remade, because they're classics that can be updated for any age, and the truths within them will always be true, because they are truths of the heart. So yeah, so in conclusion, I want you guys to know that whoever's watching, you're a prince or a princess. You're a king, you're a queen, you're special. You have a kind of uniqueness that is intrinsic to you as an individual. And that doesn't make you better than anyone, but it does set you apart from everyone else. It does mark you with a specialness, a uniqueness, a kind of spiritual signature that is yours and yours alone. And that is seen by your creator, I believe. Your maker understands that signature, loves that uniqueness, and wants to lift you up and kind of know that you're cherished. So yeah, be good to each other, guys. Remember that stories are beautiful. Remember that true royalty is about the depth of character of a person. Keep those lanterns burning. And I'll speak to you soon, guys. Peace.